Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marcie Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Responsible Endowments Coalition. The Responsible Endowments Coalition is a 10-year-old organization that works with students and alumni and other university stakeholders. You could think of them as like the beneficiaries of the endowment to ensure that endowments are being used as a force for the positive social, environmental, and economic changes that our world needs. This has been a really exciting conversation to be a part of today. I wanted to especially thank Nina Macapinlack, who is dropping some materials off from Reverend Yearwood at tables. Thank you, Nina. And Lauren Ressler, two others from the rep team who are here today. I wanted to be the first to welcome Reverend Yearwood. Reverend Yearwood is remarkable. He's the president and CEO of the Hip Hop Caucus. You can read more about him in your program. I'm going to keep this short so he can get up here and start sharing some thoughts. But I do want to emphasize how exceptional a leader he is. I struggle to think of anyone who has contributed more to advancing an understanding of climate change as being related to economic justice, to racial justice, and to basically justice of all forms. He has said before that justice is a tree with many branches, and climate justice is one of those. In addition to being president of the Hip Hop Caucus, he has also taught at Georgetown University. He has worked very closely with many leaders in hip hop to advance things like resistance to the Iraq War, resistance to torture in Guantanamo Bay, voter engagement and voter access, Gulf restoration, and then, of course, climate justice. So, without any further ado, please welcome Reverend Lennox Yearwood.
Well, first and foremost, it's definitely an honor to be here at Mount Holyoke. I've been able to hear so much about the history and the scholars and women who've come out of this awesome institution. Has always been amazing. So it's definitely good to be here in that regard, as well as just all the college presidents from Hampshire, my dear brother from Unity, who are making it happen in regards to divestment, and definitely the organizers. Barbara and George, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And so I actually want to just pick up one of the comments that was made earlier, which was maintenance and renewal of civilization. I think that's an important theme for all the missions of all the universities that we are a part of. That should be our ultimate goal. The topic of my speech during the lunch, and I've already told those in the back, if you have any fruit or apples, throw the soft things if you don't like. The apples look pretty hard, so don't throw those, but in that aspect. But hopefully you won't. But the topic of my speech is fossil-free at last. Fossil-free at last. Today is an amazing day in history. Today is actually the 50th anniversary or commemoration of the assassination of Malcolm X, which was 50 years ago today on February 21st, 1965. That also was an amazing year in 65 because also very shortly thereafter was when you have now seen the movie Selma. That was many of those watching Dr. King and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organizing around the issues of equality and trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and more importantly, just bring access of voting and equality to people of color in the South. One of the things, and I'll start with this, Dr. King wrote this. He said, one of the great tragedies of life is that men seldom bridge the gulf between practice and profession, between doing and sane. It's a persistent schizophrenia that leaves so many of us tragically divided against ourselves. We talk passionately about peace, and at the same time, we prepare for war. We make our fervent pleas for the high roads of justice, then we tread unflinchingly the low road of injustice. It's a strange economy, this agonizing gulf between the ought and the is. That represents the tragic theme of man's earthly pilgrimage. One of the things I should say up front, and you're going to hear a lot about the endowments in regards to the fossil fuel industry. I am from Louisiana. I was born in Shreveport, Louisiana. I don't think your folks are from what we call the Boot, Louisiana. But I have many family and friends who are from New Orleans. And after seeing the effects of Hurricane Katrina, which is 10 this year on August 28th, I don't find it so fond of the fossil fuel industry. That is my disclaimer going into this talk. I am not a fan of some of these corporations. When you have laid to rest your family and friends, when you have seen families washed away in storms, and even if it wasn't for Hurricane Katrina and global warming, if you have seen your mothers and uncles and cousins die because of cancer, they call Louisiana Cancer Island because of all the toxins, and you've seen children who have asthma and bronchitis, then to me, these same companies that we are investing in are rogue corporations, and they should be delegitimized because of what they are practicing. They have enough money, in my opinion, to begin the transition themselves from fossil fuel to clean energy. They can change their business plan in that aspect. For to me, when you have a company that is clearly rogue, that is clearly on an agenda that causes catastrophic calamity to not only those living now, but to future generations, I don't take so kindly to that. Now, I understand that there's a much more detailed discussion that goes along and how you divest or what you invest. But to me, when you bury loved ones because of this, it's just very difficult for me to have that kind of fondness to those companies that are profiting off of the demise of people. I also come from the ivory tower, as was mentioned before. I worked and taught at many schools. Georgetown was one of them, and I know the atmosphere of the ivory tower, where we as intellectuals can engage in the pursuits that are sometimes disconnected from the practical concerns of everyday life. And so it's important for us in this room to connect that the university as a larger part of the community around the city and the states around them, but also to see the responsibility in a broader community approach. One of the things that we're dealing with in regards to fossil fuels is in regards very similar to the struggle of slavery. It's very similar. Was at that time, it was the economic engine for our country. It was very difficult for them even to see how we could transition from a slave-based economy to one where people were free. One of the things while I was at Georgetown was that we had this thing called the Jesuit Plantation Project. One of the things that we studied there at Georgetown, where we found out that at Georgetown, we owned slaves at Georgetown. Part of the stilling conversation in 1650 at Georgetown, and it wasn't just Georgetown, many schools who also were engaged. But since I was at Georgetown, I can kind of pick on my Hoyas for a little bit. Was the fact of the matter that at that time, there were many denominations who were going forward saying, we need to stop this now. We must abolish slavery right now. The Quakers and the Methodists were going forth. They were laying themselves down on Congress. There were students like you then who were saying that slavery must be abolished. And there were institutions going around saying, we can't do that because it would be just too hard to divest, in essence, from slavery. We're too engaged. And so what Georgetown did at that time, that they actually went and said, listen, what we're going to do is that we're going to buy some slaves. And we're going to show people how to be good slave owners. And so they literally went out because this was in their board meetings. This was their trustees having this conversation. And so what they decided was we're going to go to the Maryland Eastern Shore. Georgetown was in Washington, D.C. And at that time, Georgetown was around, actually, where a lot of black people were living. But they said we're going to buy some slaves, and we're going to show slave owners how to be good slave owners. Be good Christian slave owners. So we won't beat them as much. We won't use them as much. And so this is board meeting stuff now. This is how it was. Same way you have board meetings today. This was their board meeting. And so they had this, they even said, can a man serve God faithfully and possess slaves? Was the theme of their board and trustee meeting. And today it seems ridiculous they would have such a conversation. But this went on for almost 200 years. The Jesuit Plantation Project. And with their own slaves to show how you can be a good slave owner. Until people rose up. And even we as a country went to war to end this. Because they were so afraid that it would cripple our economy. If we let, they even went so far to say that Africans, this is board meeting stuff. Africans of darker color, they're okay being slaves. It's all right. They like being slaves. If we train this too fast, then it will cripple our economy. Well, we now know that we as a country did divest, thank God for me, at least in the Bible, that we did get rid of slavery in this country. And from that, in that process. But since that time, we are now dealing with fossil fuels. Now, let me just say this quickly in that aspect. If we don't even deal with fossil fuels and the question of endowment, many young people are also dealing with the endowment itself. And what that means, because they're saying that what happens when we have 22 or 25 schools that have half of the U.S. endowment's wealth and are only enrolling 5% of the students. What is happening when you have so much wealth in these institutions, in this process? What is going on when you have these schools, these large endowments, and tuition is still going up at these institutions? And we're not seeing the process of other folks coming in to the process. What is going on when these schools that have large endowments remain tax exempt? What happens should they pay an endowment tax? What is happening at the very minimum that we dedicate endowment funds to at least lowering the tuition costs for their students? So even without even having this conversation, there is a conversation that is happening around endowments. And furthermore, in regards to fossil fuel, the fossil fuel industry is crumbling. It is crumbling before our eyes. And the jig is up. And we need to get out of that industry as fast as possible. And if you can't tell from other industries, this has happened before. The University of Rochester, which was at one time in the 70s, had the third largest endowment. But because their board refused to get out of Kodak and Xerox, because they were so vested in that, they couldn't see the transition that, with these new computers, people won't take film anymore, we should get out of the industry. They held on to that. Because of their stubbornness to hold on to that, University of Washington's endowment has crumbled because they would not transition as others did. And since that time in the 90s, went further on now to having to downsize its faculty and programs. throughout the 90s, and that even still continues today. If faculties and staff and presidents had listened to students a year ago to divest from crude oil, which then was $110 a barrel, which is now $45 a barrel and declining. If they had listened to students a year ago, they would have saved countless institutions millions, if not billions of dollars. Schools have already lost money on this carbon bubble. But where does this leave you as students and faculty and staff? I mentioned today that this is the anniversary of Dr. Malcolm X and also the 50th anniversary of Selma. I mentioned earlier that this is, for many of you right now, thinking about how we need to divest. Let me leave you with this. I've already told you that there are schools like Washington that would not divest and hung on too long. And they crippled their endowment. They were third in the 70s at the Harvard and Texas system. They were third. And they would not listen to the students, and they crumbled. The schools that see themselves in a bigger picture, to see themselves in a way where not just a school, but it's a bigger global community. I've also told you now that we've had discussions that would seem ludicrous, that we had discussions about slavery being good, and even now further to cigarettes and apartheid. So you're on the right track. You're on the right track. You're on the right battlefield. So let me leave you with this. That one of the things as we finish here now, in the 50s, students like you fought for equality. And they went out and they sat down at lunch counters. Because they simply wanted to have a lunch counter to be segregated or desegregated. So it could be black and white, brown and yellow, male, female, straight, gay. Humanity could just sit and eat lunch together. And students went out and started that process, which became the lunch counter moment of the 20th century. But now, divestment and climate change is the lunch counter moment for the 21st century. The difference is this. If they had failed then in the 50s and 60s, it'd be a horrible existence. Drinking from separate water fountains, going to different hotels, but we would exist. But if you fail to figure out a solution at this critical moment, not about equality, it's about existence. If we don't get this right, it's not about drinking from a water fountain, it's about having clean water and clean air at all. So this is our lunch counter moment for the 21st century. This is a moment for us that 100 years from now, none of us will be in this room. 21, 15, unless you find some good drugs. If you do, please hit me on Twitter. But none of us will be here. But what we do now with our endowments, our portfolios, our humanity will remain. And so Dr. King, 51 years ago, stood up before to equality, that we will be one day free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. He had no idea that black, white, brown, yellow, male and female, straight and gay, will come together so we can now have a black person sitting in the White House, and black governors, Massachusetts. Had no idea what we can do as humans. But now we sit here at this road of existence. And one day our next generation, if we are successful, they might not say free at last, but they will say that we are fossil free at last. Fossil free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are fossil free at last. Don't give up. Don't stop. This is your moment. This is our time. If not you, then who? If not now, then when? They will laugh again about fossil fuels 100 years from now, and we were debating this issue. But you are on the right side of history.